Tulikuwa tunauza shilingi 60, lakini sasa imebidi turudi nyuma kidogo kwa shilingi 50. Shauri ya uchumi. Tofauti ya shilingi 10. Kuna watu wanaleta maziwa kutoka nje, wanaleta, alafu sasa ya nje ikishakuja inazidi kiwango cha wanunuzi.
The national sector milk producers from illegal imports. I have also directed the National Treasury to impose a 16% VAT tax on all milk products that have originated from outside the EAC, the East African Community.
So that touches on agriculture, but right now let's shift focus to the unemployment issue facing the country. Allow me to start with Irene Otieno. Thank you for staying with us and for your patience. Now, we well know of the immense contribution SMEs actually play in the employment sector, not just SMEs, the private sector as well. And we have talk of the youth becoming job creators and not job seekers. But we have the same scenario where companies are closing down, some are downsizing, and I beg to ask, are we not stimulating the growth of startups? Is it an issue with overtaxing where there are levies in the county government and the national government? What is the issue?
The issue is actually a mix of what you've mentioned, and it's something that we must address. First, the multiplicity of taxes and levies at the county. Because obviously there is the demand that counties must generate on-source revenue. And the leeway they have and the type of taxes really that they can be able to apply are very limited. So they then come up with a very draconian, if you look at the finance bill from the counties, you can already see how bad things are. And so this obviously stifles economic activities within the counties, and is actually just a counter to actually the discussion of raising revenue at county level. But also when you look at it at the national level, it's a similar issue that we see. KRA has been given targets that over the years they have failed. In the last 5 years, they have not met any of those targets. So then the shift, because they then mentioned that it's only a few Kenyans that are paying taxes, we must expand the tax base. But the manner, and if you see, I just named a few, the presumptive tax, the turnover tax, these are taxes that will obviously make it harder for the SMEs to break even. So based on these taxes and the signals coming in from KRA is that moving forward, SMEs will not have it easy. Individual people going into business will not have it easy. So even when we say that we are targeting economic growth, and some of the policies that are coming out from our government then do not seem to support that decision. Secondly, also, as we tell the youth to self-employ, I do not think there's any youth who does not want to self-employ. It actually gives you a bit of leeway, some freedom to do your thing. But the challenge is, what is the state of the public services that would then enable you to even make profit? If, say, I want to open a food kiosk, I have to buy water from a private vendor. That would eat into my margins. I have to get a generator and keep buying because of power that fluctuates. So when we push the youth to then go and self-employ, we must be sending them to a public service, services that have strengthened, and they do not then have to procure public services at an additional cost. So the youth, I would say, must really push back and say, if we are to self-employ, then we must get our fair share of strengthened public services from the government. And lastly, also, even as we say that we must self-employ, we also must critically look at this wage bill issue. We've said that it's a few people that are employed at that level, but even the rates at which they are being paid is out of touch with the reality of most Kenyans. Look at the allowances. I know we have the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, which is a constitutional commission that we put in place to review both salaries of just not state officers. I think there's been undue focus on just state officers, but even the public officers. You look at the allowances that are given to these officers, it's really out of touch. It is what a youth would work for a whole month to get someone's allowances for 3 or 4 days. So I think when we're looking at shared prosperity, we just have to be genuine as a nation and relook at some of these amounts that we give, and that is what will free resources. So I do not think that the main corruption is a big issue, but there are other inequalities that we see in the wage bills, in the amount. I think government must read its own statistics. We have mentioned here before that the national statistics mentions the minimum wage at around 13,000. So when you then give someone allowances that are are so much different. What do you think this other Kenyan is, who is paying tax? What does it even send a message in terms of tax paying? We understand the KRA mentions that kulipa ushuru ni kujitegemea, but I think we miss the other part when you must apply those taxes well. And when the executive demonstrates prudent utilization of that tax, I think that is the motivation for taxpayers then to pay, because the push from KRA now is to move to the informal sector, where if you want to collect taxes, it's generally an issue of goodwill. The enforcement and collection of that tax will be a very difficult thing for KRA if the taxpayers do not see evidence that that money is being applied well. So these are issues that both national and county level must address for us as a country to move forward.
Let's address another issue, Bwana Bilo Kero, on the national and county levels. The issue that the government has seemingly failed in its role as an enabler of the growth in the economy over one issue, unpaid bills. Yes, promises were made, and to some extent they have been kept, since the amount owed is now actually less than 200 billion, believe it or not. How do we sort out this issue? Because we have liquidity crunch in the economy, yet reforms are not being executed in totality.
True. I think one of the major reasons why the economy is performing poorly is because the government is not paying for its services at both levels of government. And I agree that the figures are in the range of 200 billion, to say the least, because it's very difficult to get the accurate figures from the county governments. So the figures could be, well, much higher than that. But I think what needs to be done is not what the government is trying to do now, trying to, react. What the government needs to do is that the Public Financial Management Act is very clear. There is no way an accounting officer can procure for goods or services on credit. You have a budget that has been approved by Parliament. You have to prepare your procurement plan, and you must give out, the tenders based on funding that you have. So to the extent that there is an accounting officer somewhere in ministries or elsewhere who is giving out a tender or a procurement of services and goods for the government, and they don't have the money, that's an illegality. And the minister, the cabinet secretary for treasury, has powers to revoke the appointment of the accounting officers and completely, and take even further action. There are a lot of huge penalties provided for in the PFM Act. It has never been applied. So what happens is that then, as we speak today, forget about the previous debt. As we speak today, the ministries and the state corporations and county governments are procuring goods and services in the same way on credit, today as we speak. And it's the same. So next year, this time, we'll be talking about an additional money that has gone again, So I think it's lack of action by Treasury. And I've always said that our biggest challenge in terms of pending bills is the Treasury, because they have huge powers in law that they can apply, but they don't. And I think unless they do that, really, what they have done is to kill a lot of businesses. If you go around the counties, you'll be surprised how many businesses have been shut. Thousands of businesses. People who have borrowed, people who have struggled, people who have used their savings, and they're not being paid. Even with all the threats and pressures you hear from Treasury, there are games being played. You are told, your money is not going to be paid because the Auditor General has not approved it, or, this reason and that reason. And they're always, because what we are looking for, what is happening in both levels of government, is that nobody wants to deal with the previous debt because of rent-seeking behavior of the public officials. You want to make money on that, on every procurement opportunity. So if someone else procured, and that person has been paid his kickback previously, in the previous administration or whatever, the current administration does not want to pay. That's the fact. That's the reality. That's the problem we have. And so the best thing is not really to react. The best thing is for Treasury to be proactive and to take action on accounting officers, because they get quarterly returns. Every county submits a quarterly return before the Controller of Budget authorizes the subsequent allocation of money for them for their expense. So you can account for it. And same thing with the ministries. So I think there's a failure by institutions of the Treasury to really take action proactively.
Well, the buck stops with these institutions, definitely. Irene Otieno, I can tell you're quite enthusiastic about matters taxes, so allow me to ask you this. We understand the importance of tax collection and the role it plays in financing the budget, but when we have something like turnover tax that causes rising uproar, we have cases of VAT refunds accounting to up to 27 billion owed by the government to businesses. We have issues of deficits in meeting the budget. How do we fix this jargon called tax as a country so we can actually ensure that, yes, these deficits are less, that KRA is actually meeting its target, and businesses through the VAT refunds are not actually really affected?
True, and I think the enthusiasm around tax must be shared by all of us, as we all really paid. And I think that is what that is the problem that we must fix. Most of us as taxpayers have really delinked ourselves from issues of looking at how tax is being raised. How many of us look at the finance bills? And I think the process has shifted now, and it starts around this month of February. So at county and national, we should be having these conversations. So as you've rightfully put it, we must fix the issues of tax, fix it at two levels. I'm looking at the revenue raising. Are we raising tax in a progressive manner? Because I think that is what we have missed out at both county and national, that some of the taxes that we raise are not looking at the gender issues. Obviously, women are differently affected by tax. Youth are differently affected by tax. But what we have seen is the business associations, looking at KEPSA, looking at the chamber, they have understood that the discussions around tax, during the discussions of the finance bill, this is a crucial moment when I would say the value of a taxpayer or the value of a Kenyan shifts up, and then we must maximize that, because at the point when we have passed the budget, it is then the executive that will run amok with the implementing and using the money that we collect. So my call for all of us really as Kenyans, both people in business, individuals in formal employment, is that conversations around tax, if there is public participation during the finance bill, let us even take leave for the people who are formally employed. That is a time that will define how much we'll continue paying for the entire year. But indeed, you've mentioned about the tax refunds. This has been a critical issue to the people of business, and it must really be addressed. You have mentioned about the turnover tax, the presumptive that I had earlier alluded to, and these taxes, what we feel is that they are going to affect the bottom line of the people in the informal sector. KRA has given a contrary opinion, where for them, they say it's actually making it easier and the burden of paying it is being reduced, but we think not. However, this, for today, I wouldn't really want to vilify so much the Kenya Revenue Authority, but I think the discussion must come from higher levels. The presidency must clearly come out and tell the government at national and both county that you must respect Kenyans' hard-earned money, because the tax, when you look at the runaway corruption, you would definitely not see that government views this as the sweat of Kenyans and toils of Kenya, but they view this as just their pocket change that you can do anything with it. So if the president sets the tone and we see audit reports being addressed, we see the National Assembly and the County Assembly really looking and calling out corruption for what it is. Looking at professionals, because again, if you look at the waste of the taxpayers' money, looking at audit reports, a lot of the wastage is overseen by professionals, looking at contractors, looking at the legal profession, where, if I give an example of Nairobi, a lot of law firms were implicated in dispensing bills for legal firms that should not understand what service was provided. So there are deeper things that we really must address to ensure that Kenyans get to the point where we're saying we have Kenyans who can pay tax, because right now the conversation and telling a Kenyan to pay tax, most would look at a way of avoiding and evading, and I think that is a bit wrong. So we must address accountability issues around taxes.
Speaking of accountability issues, okay, just continue.
Yeah, let me add on that. I think they're both policy and issue, and also misplaced priorities. For example, yesterday or a couple of days ago, the president was directing Treasury and KRA to lower the taxes for manufactured vehicles. In my view, that is misplaced priorities. That factory, or those people who assemble vehicles, may be employing a few hundred Kenyans, but there are millions who are affected by other tax, measures of the government. There is tax on kerosene affecting millions of poor people. You don't look at that. You look at the cream of the society. Vehicles are luxury. Everywhere in the world, that is where people tax, governments tax. So you find a lot of those misplaced priorities. Number two, policy, I say, because every government in the world, and you see it in our constitution, tax should not be a burden on society. It is not a must for a government to insist that I have to, or we have to put an SGR, and therefore I must tax people. No. I think the government has the responsibility of putting money in the pockets of people. What is happening in the US today, yesterday actually, their debate is that to reduce the pay-as-you-earn tax so that more Americans can have money to spend in the light of these challenges of the economy caused by the coronavirus. So we have a situation where if you're earning 13,000, 15,000, you are taxed, really. And so it's misplaced priorities in my view, and those policy issues we have discussed it so many times, and we've told the government the best way of taxing society is through indirect tax, the VAT. But to put a lot of tax on employees, on a small sector of the community, really, it's also very disadvantageous. Right. And I think, in my view, the government really always misplaces their priorities in terms of taxation measures and policies.
All right. Still on matters accountability, let me rebound on that, what Irene Otieno had just brought up, because Kenya has earned a tag of a country with a high appetite for loans, and yet we know even first world countries like the US have $1 trillion budgets and they still work the same way with loans. But it seems our sole issue is in accountability. Are we really doing enough to ensure that the money being borrowed is being used to stimulate the economy? Adama Kero, what do you think about this?
No, our money is not used properly. I think that's common sense. Everyone knows. Everyone. Ask the ordinary folks in the villages. They'll tell you how the money, because you only need to read the newspapers or watch the news and see what is happening to revenue that is being collected. In other countries, yes, the governments borrow, but the governments borrow for a purpose. If it's development, the money is spent well for development. But where the other day I was trying to work out how much money the Jubilee government has borrowed the last 7 years, for development. For development alone, forget about money voted for development. It runs into nearly 20 trillion shillings. And when you look at the infrastructure or development projects that have been put up, I mean, it doesn't match. There's a complete mismatch. So as a nation, we have always had a tradition of living large. The government is where, if you really want to live, a conspicuous consumption, the extravagance, the wastage, the inefficiencies, that's where the challenge is. In addition to, of course, the corruption. So I think our challenge is not about the loans, it's about how the loans are being utilized. So when you take a pen and paper and you start calculating how much loans have been taken by this government, 5 trillion in the last few years alone, of this government, additional, and you can't find it. You can't really trace where that money has gone. Then add the amount of money that has also been collected in terms of revenue by tax, which is averaging almost 1 trillion for the last 7 years or so. So it's huge amounts of money, over 15 to 20 trillion shillings have been spent, and you don't see it. You go out to the rural areas, the challenges are there. Whether it's counties, the hospitals lack medicine. Problems of water, our women are still ferrying water, across the country, everywhere. The challenges are still the same. School bursaries, our children are out of school because of jobs.
All right.
In fact, let me tell you, the 7 million, if you look at the World Bank figures, the working age population of Kenyans is 20 million. 20 million. Only 2 million have got jobs in the modern sector. I mean, really, consistently for the last 20 years, when the government reports that we've got created 500,000 jobs or something, it's 80% of that is informal. It's not something that is counted, that there's a job that has been given to so-and-so as a welder. No, it's an estimate.
Okay.
That out there are people who 80% will always get some jobs.
All right, so Irene, yes, this is an issue, but for Kenya's ease of doing business vis-a-vis the cost of doing business in Kenya, kindly speak to us about this, because when we see companies shutting down, we see some international companies also downsizing the number of staff. What does this speak to the business environment in Kenya?
It definitely speaks to the fact that doing business in Kenya really doesn't make business sense at all, because then the cost of running that business, we've looked at power. There's the issue of power that is erratic. You have the cost of labor. You have insecurity. There are quite a lot of related issues, and I think that the conversation at both levels should be that the environment in which businesses are being done then must be strengthened. So is government listening? And I've had very good conversations. If you look at CAM, the presidential roundtable they have, I think such things must also be replicated at counties. Are counties having conversations with the business people in those localities? Looking at the economic blocks also, we've looked at the economic blocks and they're saying they're leveraging on their shared resources, and this is to attract investors. So there's also need to take stock of that and opportunities that come in from the economic bloc. But generally, we are losing out as a country in terms of investment. Most companies are closing because of the issues we've said. It's becoming a bit expensive. So as a country, we must relook and see what is it that we must address. Is it even, say, the state of our roads? We've mentioned it both in the rural and even in the urban area. So these are things that might look very small at face value. The cost of corruption does not come out very clearly, but when you look at the investors leaving the country, that should already show you that there is a problem.
Irene, quite briefly, just quick answer, yes or no, and a little bit of explanation, if you don't mind, due to time constraints. Coronavirus and the rolling effect, should we expect disruption in the supply chain line? You know, goods from China to Kenya, we're an import working country. How should we look at this?
Definitely, there's going to be, you said a yes or no because of time, so yes, that will definitely affect it, yes. But that would also allow us to look, when we are talking about a country that needs to manufacture, are we really taking that seriously? Because if we had taken manufacturing, which is one of the big four agendas, seriously, then this is something that the shocks should not be as bad. Looking again, if you allow, the technical and vocational training centers that the government is very keen about, look at the type of courses that are offered there. They're not courses that would allow us even to export. We continue to be a net importer. So I think that area also has to be revisited.
All right. Thank you so much for keeping it short as well. But we do appreciate your input right here on the big story. Irene Otieno, who's the national coordinator at National Taxpayers Association. Thank you so much. As well as Mheshimiwa Bilo Kero, who is a former Mandera senator, as well as an economist. We also appreciate Kwame Owino, who had an earlier conversation with with lead reporter Sophia Wanuna. So that marks the end. We'll continue monitoring the economic status in Kenya, even as Kenyans expect better times going forward. My name is Jesse Rogers. Keep it KTN News.